Hey everyone again. Today I want to talk a little bit about the idea of democracy. Some people haven't met a social problem that they don't think more democracy couldn't fix. Others treat democracy as kind of bad taste in politics. They think that democracy is prone to all kinds of difficulties and ultimately would prefer a more rational, or at least more elite driven, view of politics. Now, democracy's meaning, the meaning that most people attach to the word, has evolved throughout history. Until about 1800 or so, democracy meant direct democracy, which meant that it was effectively restricted to small states, right? Like in classical ancient Athens or small Italian city-states. Since 1800 or so, democracy has tended to mean representative democracy. What used to be called a republic, and you'll even run into people today who say, really, America is not a democracy, it's a republic, which is a distinction in some ways without a difference, because most people today call republics democracies. Also, the connotation attached to the meaning of the word democracy has changed. Until about 1900 or so, the word democratic usually was referring to something bad, especially something mediocre or vulgar. Since then, though, people have attached much more popular connotations to it. In particular, when people talk about democracy today, they often mean fair and legitimate government. Indeed, the struggle for democracy has probably defined the last 45 or 50 years of history in the developing world. Now, how are we to make sense of these different meanings and different connotations attached to democracy? I would say that when we're looking at the meaning of words, concepts are usually defined for a purpose. People use the word democratic for at least two distinct purposes, and I think helps us make sense of the differences in usage that we see. Social scientists use the word democratic as a way of distinguishing different kinds of real-world regimes that they study. There are regimes where there are free, fair, and competitive elections for positions of executive and legislative importance, and then there's those regimes where there isn't. Political theorists sometimes use the term to designate a kind of ideal of freedom and equality. Now, this ideal is often hard to satisfy, and it can also apply far more widely than just politics. You can have democracy in the family, democracy in the workplace, and so on and so forth. So it's not that democracy on this account is a thing out there in the world to be studied, but it's actually an ideal that's very difficult to attain, and therefore it must also be a good thing. Now, if we add to this set of confusions that there are different social scientists and different theorists who put different standards in place as to what counts as a real-world democracy or what would be ideal. Once you put all of that together, you can see that democracy is a very confusing concept indeed. In fact, if I ask my American national government students what they think democracy is, they often think democracy is, well, whatever America is. Now, I can't sit here and tell you what democracy is. The only thing that I can do is highlight how different people in the world use the word and for what purposes they use the word, so that you yourselves can better understand what people are talking about when they use that word. If someone says that a practice is not democratic, they're usually saying that it fails to meet some standard or requirement that they think a set of institutions ought to have. Okay, so what could some of these features be? Well, a lot of people will criticize a lack of participation in decision-making by the people. So, for instance, people will critique the executive branch of the United States and our bureaucracy because its major bureaucrats are not elected, but they're appointed. And because they're not elected, people think that they are therefore not accountable, at least not directly, to the people. Since the people aren't participating in the decision-making, then bureaucracy must be undemocratic. The same can also be said of the Supreme Court, by the way. Another way that people could say something is undemocratic is that some feature of our system might be unequal in the way people's interests are taken into account. So if some people's interests just don't seem to matter in the decision-making process, you might say that the decision-making process is undemocratic. Finally, or another possible view is that something undemocratic is reflects a lack of equality in the status of different members. So some people aren't getting the respect that they deserve. This is usually associated with claims by various minority groups that rarely get to participate in the decision-making process directly because they are frequently in the minority. And finally, some people talk about things being undemocratic when they mean a lack of individual liberty. And I think this is perhaps the least defensible use of the word undemocratic, but it is something that you hear. When people's civil rights are or civil liberties are violated, some people point to a lack of democracy. Now, again, I think this is confused, but at least the first three senses on this slide, I think, are pretty well entrenched. I think there's a clear, and the reason I think that this view of democracy as a lack of liberty, or something undemocratic being something unfree, as being problematic, is that there's a clear conceptual distinction here to be made between liberalism on the one hand and democracy on the other hand. Liberal regimes protect individual rights. Democratic regimes are where governmental decisions are subject to popular approval. Now, historically, the two tended to go together, especially in the West, where democracies developed earliest. But I think that there is now, it's much more easy to recognize a clear distinction between regimes that protect individual rights, individual freedom, and regimes that do whatever the people tell them to do. Today, in particular, there are some non-liberal democracies. There are social democracies that tend to emphasize economic planning and equality over liberty, and over economic liberty especially. And finally, there are countries in the developing world who are forging their own paths towards development and towards democracy, but it seems that they are not emulating the West as much as we thought they would, I guess, at some point. And so countries like Iran, Turkey, Botswana, Kenya, Indonesia all provide examples of democracies with other commitments than commitments to individual rights, whether these be religious commitments, commitments to stability and order through the military, or other. So I think today there's at least three basic types of democracies in the world: liberal democracies, social democracies, and what we might call electoral democracies. Liberal democracies, or in liberal democracies, individuals have the right to vote and the right to have that vote actually be counted, the right to form political parties, the right to associate to promote your political interests, the right to speak freely on political matters, perhaps the right also to have alternate sources of information available to sources provided by the government or elite sources. But in liberal democracies, individuals need not have any particular standard of living, any time to participate or become informed on issues of common concern, any linguistic or cultural rights to, again, their own local culture or language, and any right to local differences. So it's not the case that liberal democracies need to be associated with federalism or with decentralization of political power. In social democracies, individuals have many of the same rights as in liberal democracies. They have the right to vote and have that vote count, the right to form political parties, the right to associate to promote their political interests, the right to speak freely on political matters, the right to have alternative sources of information. But they also have the right to a standard of living adequate to the purposes of participation, and the right to avoid economic dependence on other private citizens. In other words, the ideal of citizenship is one of freedom, yes, but also independence from other private citizens, such that no one's employment status or residential status as a renter with a landlord need make them dependent on that landlord or employer, and so to make their vote perhaps more independent than it might otherwise be. But in social democracies, individuals need not always have an unlimited right to spread your views, particularly if their views are likely to drown out minority views. They don't necessarily have an unlimited right to form political parties whose views are anti-democratic. In social democracies, in particular in Europe, some parties are banned. In particularly Nazi parties can be banned. In some of the post-communist countries like Hungary and Czechoslovakia, communist parties were banned for a long time. They might still be, although that might be starting to change. And finally, they don't necessarily have an unlimited right of free speech that might tend to diminish the ability or tendency of the vulnerable to participate. So some kinds of hate speech in particular might be forbidden, even if it's got political content to it, in a way that in the United States we would, perhaps regretfully, but still permit it. The last kind of democracy I want to touch base upon is what you might call merely electoral democracies. So democracies with elections and not much else. A lot of democratic theorists and social scientists hesitate to include these countries in the families of democracy, but again, not including them risks importing into the ideal of democracy Western values that other cultures may not accept, like liberalism, for instance, and individual rights. So in electoral democracies, individuals definitely have the right to vote, and they definitely have some right to form parties and run for office. So you're going to have competitive elections of some kind. But in electoral democracies, individuals need not have access to alternative sources of information always. So it's possible that the media might be state-controlled or state-run. You see this in a lot of the Central Asian post-Soviet republics, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, places like that. In electoral democracies, people do not need to be free necessarily always from intimidation for their political views or activities. So it's not the case that you have an unlimited right to form associations to protest and so on and so forth. In that sense, politics can still be quite dangerous. You certainly don't have a right to any particular standard of living. And you don't necessarily have a right to have collective control over all aspects of state policy. And that's the most frequent focus of criticism of places like Iran, where, yes, there's competitive multi-party democracy, but only over a certain range of issues. So some range of religious issues you don't get to vote on. But note that, on the one hand, that seems very illiberal of us. How could we not let the people have final say over all matters of public policy that they want to? On the other hand, we don't either in the United States. Our Constitution limits how much the majority of American citizens can control both economic policy as well as civil rights and civil liberties and so on and so forth. We place individual rights beyond democratic decisions in the United States. Other countries, I think, can place other things beyond the right of majorities to change, and I don't think that makes it necessarily not a democracy, although, again, many battles can be fought over that sort of thing.